Our question is that the Gemara says when Hashem told Avraham to take Yitzchak and to bring him as an offering, the famous Akedah, so he said, Kach, no, please take your son. And the question was why? Why does he say, please take your son? We suggested different possibilities, but we pretty much at this point have shown that all of these possibilities don't make sense. So yesterday, Gershon said, well, the greatness of Avraham was that he was the first person to ever do this. And that's a very big deal. So we're going to start our conversation today with that idea about being the first person to sacrifice his life or to sacrifice something for Hashem. Now, why is that such a big deal to be the first person to do something? We touched on it very briefly yesterday. So we're going to unpack it further. Chassidus explains that the way life operates is there are, for lack of a better word, and to actually borrow the expression we use in Chassidus, there are channels of energy that exist in the world. And until a channel is opened, it's not available. So, for example, just to bring it back to something we could relate to, the teaching of Chassidus itself is something that was not always available to the Jewish community. There was a time where Hashem allowed the teaching of Chassidus to enter the world. So that channel then opened, and thereafter it's possible to have access to this very unique perspective and depth of Torah learning. And by the way, that you could say that happened multiple times during the course of history. Until there was a Gemara, that channel for that way of learning the Torah was not yet open. Here's another example. Before the Torah was given, because you could ask the question, what was the big chap of giving the Torah? There was a big demonstration and presentation that happened at Mount Sinai. But the reality is that we're told that before that, our forefathers kept the Torah. So what are you giving us if for history, for generations, they were already keeping the Torah? And we know this. We know that Avraham made matzahs, and we know that Yaakov fulfilled the mitzvah of tefillin, and we have various other examples of mitzvahs and observance of Torah that already happened. So what changed at the time of the giving of the Torah? There was a new channel that was opened. Up until that point, it was not possible to fuse the holiness of a mitzvah into the physical item that you used to do the mitzvah. So if you put on tefillin in those days, the tefillin did not become a holy object. You got a mitzvah, but the tefillin couldn't become holy. That channel wasn't yet available. So to break open a new channel, it's not just about being the first person to do something. It's not the first person to run the 1 minute mile, or whatever it is, whatever the record is, right? It's not that you're the person who's breaking a psychological barrier and now other people see that this is possible. It's the person who has to work through a whole process in the world to be able to open a dimension of the world that did not exist before. So Avraham, before Avraham has Mesiras Nefesh, before he's willing or is the first person to sacrifice his things, his life, his interests for Hashem, there wasn't such a possibility. And by the way, you could see an example of this in his predecessor, right? Look at Noach. The whole story of Noach, even though he saves his family and he saves the species of all the animals, etc., etc., he doesn't have to sacrifice anything. To the contrary, he's protecting himself. He's not putting himself on the line. He's actually looking after himself. So we don't have a precedent of somebody who is willing to go that mile and dedicate themselves and, so to speak, die for the cause until Avraham comes along. So maybe that's the big cup over here. When there's precedent, you could say, you should behave like Avraham. So I'm not going to tell you, please do it, because there's precedent and it's considered, so to speak, now part and parcel of what it is to be dedicated to Hashem. Whereas Avraham is the first person to do it, so Hashem's got to say, please, I want you to do this because it's a very major shift in the whole dynamic of how life works, and please make sure that you succeed in doing this.
You mentioned yesterday that he could have debated and argued.
Right.
The point. He actually did before this with Sodom. He had a debate with Hashem.
That's
said,
true.
Destroy Sodom, even if there was one Jew, one past person.
That's true. So that only emphasizes the point that if Avraham was bold enough to debate Hashem about Sodom, because he had a good reason to do so, should the judge of all of all life not do justice, then he definitely could have debated here too and said, you who promised me that Yitzchak would be the one to carry on the legacy, how can you tell me to kill him? So that's exactly the point. He could have debated Hashem, and he didn't.
He asked him to by saying please. It was actually a request.
That's right.
Not a
But
command.
that's the point. Because he had a reason to have debated him, that would be enough of an explanation why he can't give the command and he has to make the request. But we were still not satisfied with that, because we do know that through the course of history there were other people who could have also debated and said, I don't have to do this at this particular point in time. And yet they went ahead and did so. So that's not yet a clear enough explanation for what's so spectacular about what Avraham is doing over here.
So when Moshe debated with Hashem about wiping out everybody,
Right.
and he succeeded,
Right.
wasn't that something as well?
Okay, so again, when you see both of those examples, when Abraham is debating with Hashem on behalf of the people of Sodom, or when Moshe is debating with Hashem on behalf of Lahavdil, the Jewish people, in both of those cases, they're not being challenged to sacrifice something of their own. So it's a lot easier
That's
to
even
fight.
worse, the whole nation.
I know, but it's a lot easier to fight for somebody else, because you could argue the injustice. They shouldn't be harmed. They shouldn't be killed. Whereas over here, Hashem is telling him to do something himself. So this is a matter of his own sacrifice. Obviously, you should be protecting other people. And even if that means that you have to argue with Hashem, that's what you should be doing. Whereas over here, Hashem's asking him to do something which requires his sacrifice. and we're saying that he had a way that he could have argued his way out of it, and he chose not to. But what we're focused on right now is, what does it mean to be the first person to sacrifice your life for Hashem? I thought you were going to ask a different question, which is, if the big chap of Avraham is that he's the first person to sacrifice himself for Hashem, then surely that is something that already happened much earlier than the story of the Akedah. Because we've already discussed the fact that when he was a young man, and he was traveling around teaching everybody about belief in a single God, we've already learned that at that time there was somebody who took exception to it. That was Nimrod. Nimrod was the king, but Nimrod was also a self-declared deity. And he was offended by the fact that Abraham refused to accept that he was this God. And so Nimrod challenged him at that particular point in time and said, well, how real is your belief? Like, if you're going to insist on this belief, I'm going to throw you into the furnace. And Avraham says, okay, well, if that's the case, you're going to have to throw me into the furnace. Is that not a moment of self-sacrifice?
Himself.
Yeah, but it's still self-sacrifice. In other words, if you're saying that Avraham is the first person in history to be willing to sacrifice for Hashem, and when you're the first person to do something, that opens the channel, then logically it should be the first time he does it. If you're opening the channel, and if it doesn't exist before that, then logically it makes sense that when do you open the channel? When you go ahead for the first time to sacrifice yourself. Which for Abraham happened decades before the Akedah, when he was standing in Nimrod's court, and Nimrod threatened, and then actually threw him into the furnace. And I'll add another layer to this. When it came to the Akedah, to sacrifice Yitzchak, where did that idea come from? To go and sacrifice Yitzchak. Came from Hashem, right? Hashem said to him, Kach Noes bincha, I want you to take your son and go up to Mount Moriah and bring him as an offering to Hashem. So it's Hashem's instruction. When Nimrod says to Avraham, do you believe in your faith strong enough that I should throw you into a furnace? Where did that idea come from? That he says, yes, you can throw me into the furnace.
From Nimrod.
From himself.
Yeah.
Right? In other words, Hashem doesn't tell him, please jump into the furnace. Abraham is so dedicated that he says, I'm going to jump into the furnace. So which is a greater sacrifice? Is it a greater sacrifice to do something that you're told to do, or to do something that you, of your own volition, decide that you're going to do?
That could be argued.
Okay, you're right. It could be argued. So let's unpack it.
The wrong side, the wrong path.
That what?
I think that I'm going to do it, but you actually shouldn't be doing it.
Okay, so that's assuming that it would have been the wrong thing to do. But because we know that as a principle of Judaism, when it comes to idolatry, a person is supposed to give up their life, so it actually is the correct path. Now, the fact that he took that correct path of his own accord, is that something that is more or less of a deal than the fact that Hashem told him, please take your son? In other words, what shows greater dedication?
The first one.
The first, right? When you're doing something of your own accord, surely that's the greatest sacrifice. Because, again, even to your point, like, I don't know if this is the correct thing to do, maybe it's not acceptable. Remember that part of the Noachide code is that a person is not allowed to kill themselves. So even though the Torah wasn't yet given, the fact that he's willing to put his life on the line, who knows that that is an acceptable practice? So it takes a tremendous amount of sacrifice on his part to be able to do this. Whereas the Akedah, he's given a map. This is what I'd like you to do. So, okay, at least I know this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Might be very difficult, but it's not, I can't claim that this is my great dedication in the same way as by Ur Kasdim, surely. So if the argument is, and we talk about this a lot in Hasidus, that the greatness of Avraham and his sacrifice was that he opened this channel of sacrifice that previously was not part and parcel of the world, and we're willing to accept that that is Avraham's contribution to this notion of sacrifice, then it really does not make sense that we had to wait until the Akedah, and only now do we say, there it is. That's the sign of sacrifice. And I'll prove it, because what do we read about every day in our davening? Not Avraham going into the furnace of Ur Kasdim. We never read about that. Not in the davening, and even in the Torah, it's only insinuated. It's not even spelled out. You have to wait till the Midrash to explain to you what happened when Hashem says, I took you out of Ur Kasdim. That sounds like Hashem was just moving him from a geographical location. And the Midrash has to say, no, you have to understand, Ur means fire, and Ur Kasdim was this big furnace that he was thrown into. Like, we don't even know this information. Whereas the Akedah, we're supposed to read every single day. And the reason why we're supposed to read it every single day is to consolidate in our minds the idea of sacrifice to Hashem. Why is the Akedah the symbol of opening the channel of sacrifice and what it means to have Mesiras Nefesh, more so than when Abraham was literally ready, and not only ready, but physically went into this devastating furnace that could have killed him. And it was only because Hashem did a miracle, which he did not know was going to happen, that he survived. Now that's real sacrifice, because you don't know that you're going to come out of this alive. So why is that not the big story of Avraham and the big story of sacrifice? Take it one step further, going back to what the Gemara told us. The Gemara said that the reason Hashem uses the word please when he introduces the idea of the Akedah is because Hashem is telling Avraham, please make sure that you pass this test, because if you do not pass this test, then that's going to retroactively indicate or give people the impression that all the previous 9 tests had no substance. In other words, what we're saying over here is that to have jumped into the furnace or have been thrown into the furnace by Nimrod, which was a willingness to die for the cause, could be disqualified and not considered Mesiras Nefesh if he doesn't do the Akedah. Now why? I mean, let's be honest. That surely is the highest level of sacrifice for God. He was willing to allow them to kill him. And now we're saying, well, we don't know. Maybe that wasn't really sacrifice. Let's see if you could do this one and shecht your child, because without that, maybe everything else is null and void. Doesn't seem to make any sense. So I guess what we really need to do is ask ourselves, what do we mean when we say sacrifice? You know, people are always making sacrifices for various things. You hear parents telling their children, I sacrificed so many things for you. And, if I hadn't been so invested in you, I could have done X, and I could have had this money, and I could have gone on those vacations, and who knows what. So people are constantly making sacrifices. If you want to be an observant Jewish person, you're constantly making sacrifices. You can't go to that restaurant. You can't go to that show or that sports event because it's on a Shabbos, and so on and so on. We're always making sacrifices, right? But the truth of the matter is, we have to try and understand, what does sacrifice really mean? Or at least in this context, let's use the original language, Mesiras Nefesh. Now, Mesiras Nefesh is an interesting term, and it is the term that we use to represent sacrifice for Hashem. Mesiras Nefesh means handing over your nefesh. Now, nefesh is a term that could either describe your soul, although in that case it's describing the least developed, the lowest part of the soul. or it could just simply represent the whole of you. Your nefesh is the whole of you. So Mesiras Nefesh implies that a person is willing to give up the whole of themselves for Hashem. They're willing to give up everything for Hashem. So we need to appreciate, what does that mean? What does it mean to give everything for Hashem? So we have a principle that we speak about a lot in Chassidus, and it's effectively, it will sit at the core of understanding this idea of Mesiras Nefesh. So throughout Chassidus, we talk about the idea of what is called bittul. So if you've studied a bit of Chassidus, you'll be familiar with this principle of bittul. What does it mean? So,
It's subdued, like be.
okay, so it's more than subdue. So
You have complete faith. It's like
correct.
No,
So bittul will relate to faith.
you're nothing. It's like
So there's the thing. Bittul means to lose your sense of self. That's what bittul means. So let's unpack that. Let's understand what that means. It's actually probably the most accessible place that we have an illustration of what bittul is in the laws of kashrus. So what happens, so the classic example, so somebody's cooking a cholent. I'm only using that example because it was relevant this week. Somebody's cooking a cholent. It's a nice large cholent with a lot of meat inside. And somehow, I don't know how, and the backstory is not really relevant, but somehow a person spills some milk into the cholent. Now that's what we call a kashrut emergency, right? So now the question is, what do you do? What do you do with the cholent?
depends how much milk.
It depends how much milk. Why does it depend how much milk?
160.
Because we need to have what is called bittul. In other words, our understanding is if you've got 60 times more volume of one substance than the other substance, so in this case, if you've got 60 times more cholent than the amount of milk that spills inside of it, then we understand that that milk will be completely absorbed into the cholent to the extent that you'll never know that it was there. That's what we call bittul. What that means is that if I had to eat this cholent, I would in no way be able to detect that milk had gotten mixed into it because it's such a minute amount that it is nullified, it is cancelled, it's neutralized. It has no impact on the cholent. Now let's say for argument's sake that it was not a bit of milk that dropped into the cholent. Let's say that it was a piece of cheese. Same quantity. So it's also less than 1/60th of the cholent. What's the law now? The law is I can't eat the cholent. The law is I cannot eat the cholent. I have to find the piece of cheese and I have to remove it because I can't pretend that it's been neutralized because it hasn't. It's there. It's actually okay. Well, if it would melt completely, which it won't, right? It will become more rubbery or whatever. It's not going to melt completely. If it would melt completely, then it's the same as a liquid. So, in other words, the meaning of bittul is not just that something is completely overwhelmed and therefore you're, so to speak, not aware of it. The meaning of bittul is that it really doesn't exist anymore. Now, in our connection and relationship with Hashem, Chassidus talks about the idea that we're supposed to achieve a state of bittul, which means that I am completely invisible in the picture. Life is only about Hashem. It's not about me. Now, the nature of human beings is not that way. The nature of human beings is that we are front and center. You know, that's why they say that you could take one finger and make the whole world disappear. Right? You take one finger, put it over your eyes, and that's it. Or you don't even have to put it over your eyes. You can just look at your finger, and the rest of the world blurs out because the nature of human beings is that we put ourselves front and center. And so we spend our lives effectively always making these decisions and doing these personal audits which say, is this in my interest? Is this worth my while? So for example, the Torah says do X. If we can convince ourselves that X works for us, then we're going to do it. That's why people are constantly telling us, no, you should keep Shabbos. You know why? Because we live such a stressful life that we need that day to be able to have downtime. Okay, that makes sense to me. In that case, I'm going to keep Shabbos because I need the downtime. And because we need to reduce our carbon emissions. So one day a week, I'm not going to drive my car, or whatever the things are. So I've made this thing make sense to myself. Until what? Until there's a simcha or a family get-together on the other side of town. and now I can't participate because it's too far to walk. Well, if the whole purpose of Shabbos was because I needed to be able to have my downtime and my family time, now Shabbos doesn't make sense to me anymore. Maybe I'm going to say, I'll make an exception under these circumstances. I'll actually go to that particular event or participate in that family affair, whatever the case is. When a person has bittul, what that means is they say, it's not about me. I don't feature in this. Hashem has a plan for the world. Obviously, Hashem's plan is the ideal plan for the world. Hashem has a guide for my life. Obviously, that's the ideal guide for my life. So it's not about me. I'm not going to shape the whole of Judaism to suit my sensitivities or my sensibilities. I'm going to do what Hashem wants. That is where Mesiras Nefesh lies. Mesiras Nefesh lies in the capacity to surrender what I'm interested in. And that's why in Chassidus we often talk about Mesiras Nefesh as Mesiras HaRatzon. I have my Ratzon. I have the things that I really care about, that I really want. They are an expression of my soul. And I'm willing to surrender the things that I really want in favor of what Hashem wants. And that's really the ultimate way to build a relationship with Hashem, the ultimate way to serve Hashem, is to be able to say, I'm going to suspend my interests and do instead what Hashem wants. Now, the most extreme version of that is practical Mesiras Nefesh, where a person's going to say, I'm ready to die for Hashem. Or I'm ready to give away the things that I care about most for Hashem. Not just, I'm going to suspend my personal interests and do what Hashem wants, but I'm willing to sacrifice everything. And that's what Avraham is doing over here. Avraham is not just simply saying that I'm a believer, and therefore when my beliefs are challenged, well, I'll go to the nth degree because I believe in these things and they're very important to me, and I need to ensure that my faith remains solid, and therefore I'm going to do everything in my power. Avraham is saying, I'm here to serve Hashem. Whatever Hashem wants from me, that's what I'm going to do. If he wants me to jump in the fire, I'll jump in the fire. Like the kids always say, if so-and-so told you to jump in the fire, right? So if Hashem wants me to jump in the fire, I'm going to jump in the fire. Not because it's my faith that's being tested, not because it's my ideals that I have to stand up for, but because this is what Hashem wants. So when we speak about Avraham opening the channel for Mesiras Nefesh, what we mean is that up until this point in time, that concept of complete bittul, that ability to surrender everything for what Hashem wants, didn't yet exist. And Avraham introduces that into the world. And where he introduces it into the world is specifically at the time of the Akedah, not because Avraham doesn't have that bittul earlier in his life, it's just because until the Akedah, nobody else could identify that Avraham had that level of dedication to Hashem. And the Akedah proved it. How so? That we'll learn next time.